The judge slammed his gavel down on the scarred wooden desk and told Wesley Hawkins that he had exactly two choices: rot in a Kansas prison for the next 5 years, or take himself and his dusty boots all the way out to the New Mexico territory and never darken the doorstep of Dodge City again. Wesley had chosen the territory, not because he was particularly eager to start over, and not because he harbored any romantic notion about wide-open land and fresh beginnings. He had chosen it because the Kansas State Penitentiary smelled like death and broken men, and Wesley Hawkins, whatever else he might be called, had never been a man who took well to cages. That was the spring of 1878, and he rode southwest with nothing more than a cantankerous gray horse named Coin, a bedroll that had seen better decades, a Winchester rifle that was reliable if nothing else, and the kind of hardened silence that wraps itself around a man when he has decided the world owes him nothing and he owes the world even less. He had not stolen those cattle out of greed, or at least that was the version of the story Wesley preferred to tell himself during the long hours of riding. He had stolen them because his employer, a fat-fingered rancher named Corbin Dells, had cheated 12 men out of 3 months of wages and laughed while he did it. Wesley had simply taken what was owed in the form of livestock, distributed the animals among the men, and miscalculated precisely how much the law would care about the distinction between justice and theft. The judge had not been particularly interested in nuance. So here he was, riding into a territory that was simultaneously brutal and staggering in its beauty, all red mesa and endless sky, and the particular golden silence of a land that did not care one way or another whether you lived or died inside it. He reached the town of Ember Creek on a Wednesday afternoon in late April, when the cottonwood trees along the creek bed were just beginning to push out their pale green leaves, and the air smelled like warm earth and something faintly sweet that he could not immediately name. The town itself was the kind of settlement that existed in a determined state of becoming, not quite enough buildings to feel permanent, not quite desolate enough to feel abandoned. There was a general store, a livery stable, a saloon that doubled as a post office, a small whitewashed church that listed slightly to the east, and a scattering of homes and outbuildings that spread along the creek like an afterthought. Wesley tied Coin to the post outside the livery and went in to ask about work, because work was the thing a man needed first, before he could think about anything else. The liveryman was a broad-shouldered man of about 50 named Hector Beaumont, and he looked Wesley over with the frank assessment of a man who had seen plenty of hard cases come through and learned to read them quickly. "You a drinker?" Hector asked. "Not professionally," Wesley said. "You a fighter?" "Only when the situation calls for it." Hector seemed to find this acceptable. "I need somebody who can muck stalls, shoe horses, and fix fence when the need arises. Pay is $1.50 a week plus board in the loft." "You interested?" Wesley was interested. He was not proud, and $1.50 a week was $1.50 more than he currently had. "I'll start tomorrow," Wesley said. "You'll start now," Hector said. "The morning stalls don't muck themselves." Wesley took off his coat and got to work. He had been in Ember Creek for 5 days, sleeping in the loft above the horses and eating his meals at the small counter inside the livery, when he first saw Opal Covington. She came into the livery on a Friday morning, driving a buckboard wagon with a kind of focused competence that immediately told him she was not a woman who required assistance with such things. She had dark auburn hair pinned up under a sun-weathered hat, strong, capable hands on the reins, and an expression of determined preoccupation, as though she was already thinking 3 steps ahead of whatever task had brought her here. She was 23 years old, though Wesley did not know this yet, and she had the kind of face that became more interesting the longer you looked at it, not conventionally pretty in the way that saloon paintings were pretty, but alive in a way that made conventional prettiness seem beside the point. "Hector," she said, pulling the wagon to a stop, "2 of my fence posts along the south pasture came down in that wind last week." I've got the wire, but I need a post driver and someone who knows how to set them properly so they actually stay. Morning to you too, Miss Covington, Hector said, with the fond tolerance of a man who had known a person since childhood. She had the grace to look briefly embarrassed. Good morning, Hector. How is your wife? Ornery as ever, which I take as a sign of good health. Now, as it happens, I've just taken on a fellow who knows his way around fence work. He gestured toward Wesley, who was standing near the far stall in the process of deciding whether to pretend he hadn't been watching her since she drove in. He decided pretending was not really worth the effort. Opal Covington looked at him with the same frank assessment Hector had used, except that where Hector had seemed satisfied fairly quickly, she appeared to reserve her judgment more deliberately. You know fence work? She asked. I do, Wesley said. Have you ever worked with barbed wire specifically? I have. Glidden wire, probably, from the way you described it. Something in her expression shifted, not quite warming yet, but perhaps becoming fractionally less guarded. Yes. When can you come out? I don't have anything pressing this afternoon, Wesley said, which was not entirely true since Hector had a wagon wheel that needed attention, but Hector waved a hand as if to indicate the wheel could wait. Then I'll come back at noon, Opal said, and she turned the buckboard with neat efficiency and drove back out onto the main street. Wesley watched her go. He was not the sort of man who watched women go as a general habit, but there was something about the way she handled those reins, the particular set of her shoulders, capable and unbothered and entirely self-contained, that made looking away seem like a waste. That's Opal Covington, Hector said behind him, in the tone of a man beginning an explanation that he expects will be needed. Her daddy, Gene Covington, passed 2 winters ago, left her the ranch, the Double C, about 4 miles east of here. She's been running it on her own since then, which people in this town have opinions about, none of which she cares to hear. Sounds like a sensible woman, Wesley said. Hector looked at him with what might have been the beginning of amusement. She is. She's also the most stubborn human being in the New Mexico territory, so if you're thinking anything along those particular lines, I'd recommend keeping your thoughts to yourself until you understand what you're dealing with. Wesley turned back to the wagon wheel and said nothing, which Hector seemed to find answer enough. At noon, Opal returned in the buckboard, and Wesley loaded the post driver into the back along with his tools and climbed up beside her on the bench. She set the horse moving at a brisk trot, and for the first 10 minutes neither of them said anything, which Wesley found oddly comfortable. He was not a man who felt compelled to fill silence, and she appeared to feel the same way. The road east wound through scrub juniper and patches of grama grass that was just beginning to green up after the winter, and the sky above them was the precise shade of blue that makes a person feel the world is larger and more generous than it actually is. Wesley watched the landscape and thought about very little, which was unusual for him. Hector says you're new to the territory, Opal said, not looking at him, keeping her eyes on the road. I am. Where did you come from? Kansas most recently. What brings you out here? There was a brief pause while Wesley considered how honest to be, and then decided that partial honesty was probably the most sustainable option. I needed a change of circumstances, he said. She glanced at him sideways. There was a sharpness in her eyes that suggested she understood that this answer meant more than it said, and that she was filing the observation away. Fair enough, she said, and returned her attention to the road. The Double C was a working ranch of about 400 acres, spread across a long, shallow valley with the creek running along its southern edge. The house was a solid adobe structure with a wooden porch added later, practical and unpretentious, surrounded by several outbuildings, and a barn that was clearly better maintained than the house. There were cattle visible in the middle pasture, a modest herd of perhaps 40 head, and 2 horses in the paddock near the barn. Everything about it spoke of careful management of limited resources, the particular economy of a person who wastes nothing because there is nothing to waste. South Fence is this way, Opal said, driving past the house and along a rutted track that ran beside the pasture fence. They reached the damaged section, where two posts had indeed come down, pulling the wire with them into a tangle of rust-bright barbs. Wesley studied the ground, checked the depth of the remaining posts, assessed the soil composition. The posts that came down were probably not set deep enough to begin with, he said. If the original depth was less than 2 feet in this soil, they'll keep coming down. My father set them, Opal said, and her voice was perfectly level, but Wesley caught something in it that made him choose his next words with more care. He probably didn't anticipate the wind pattern in this particular stretch. You've got a gap in the tree line up there, he pointed to the northwest. That would funnel wind directly across this section. It's not a mistake in construction, it's just a matter of the land changing as the trees grew. He could feel her looking at him, and when he turned she was regarding him with an expression he couldn't quite read. That's a diplomatic answer, she said. It's an accurate one, Wesley said, and reached for the post driver. He spent 2 hours setting the new posts deep and solid, restringing the wire with the careful tension that kept it taut without making it brittle, checking 3 additional posts in the surrounding section that showed signs of similar weakness. Opal worked alongside him without being asked to, handing tools, holding wire, doing none of the theatrical helplessness that he had occasionally encountered in women who felt that labor was below them. She worked like someone who had been doing physical work her whole life and saw no reason to perform fragility about it. When they were finished, she stood back and looked at the fence line with the critical satisfaction of a person checking off a necessary task. It looks solid, she said. It is solid, Wesley said. She turned to look at him again with that sideways assessment, and this time something in her expression had shifted towards something that was not yet warmth but was at least the absence of wariness. You do good work, she said, and it was clearly not a compliment she distributed freely, because she said it with the particular awkward directness of someone who has decided honesty is worth the discomfort. So do you, Wesley said, meaning the fence but also somehow meaning the whole spread around them, the maintained buildings, the healthy cattle, the evident orderliness of a place that kept running through sheer force of will. She looked at him a moment longer than was quite neutral, and then she said, "There's coffee in the house if you want it before the ride back." He wanted it. The kitchen of the Double C was clean and spare, and smelled of coffee and cornbread, and something herbal that turned out to be a bunch of dried sage hanging above the window. Opal poured 2 mugs and set one in front of him without ceremony, and she sat across the table and wrapped her hands around her own mug and looked out the window toward the pasture. "Do you have horses?" she asked. "One, gray gelding named Coin. Good horse, stubborn, but reliable." She smiled slightly at that, and it was the first full smile he had seen from her, and it did something to the general atmosphere of the room that Wesley declined to examine too closely. "I have a mare who's about to foal," she said. "She's been making me nervous for a week. First foal, no, third, but she had trouble with the second and I can't stop thinking about it." "I've helped with difficult foals," Wesley said. "If you need an extra pair of hands when the time comes, I'm not hard to find." She looked at him with a kind of cautious evaluation, the look of a person weighing whether an offer comes with complications attached. Apparently she decided it did not, or at least not the kind of complications she was worried about. "I might take you up on that," she said. He finished his coffee, thanked her, and she drove him back to the livery in the blue and gold of the late afternoon, and they talked about horses the entire way back, and it was the most comfortable conversation Wesley had had with another human being in longer than he could readily remember. 3 days later, she appeared at the livery just after dawn looking slightly less composed than she usually did, which on Opal Covington meant that a small crease of worry had appeared between her brows and her hands were moving with a restless energy. "The mare is foaling and it's not going the right way," she said without preamble. Wesley was already pulling on his coat. He told Hector where he was going, which Hector acknowledged with the wave of a man who expected exactly this development, and he rode Coin out to the Double C at a good clip while Opal's buckboard moved ahead of him. "The mare, A deep bay named Duchess was in the barn and she was in trouble. Wesley assessed the situation quickly. The foal was positioned wrong, and Duchess was exhausted and frightened, her dark eyes showing white at the edges. "All right," Wesley said quietly, rolling up his sleeves. "I need you to keep her head calm." He talked Opal through what he was doing as he worked, both because she needed to know for the future and because keeping his voice steady and matter-of-fact seemed to calm the mare as much as anything. Opal moved to Duchess's head and spoke to her in a low, continuous murmur, one hand stroking the mare's neck, and the horse's breathing steadied fractionally. It took the better part of an hour, and it was hard and exhausting work, and at several points Wesley was not certain how it would end. But it ended with a foal, a pale gray colt, impossibly spindly-legged and wet and alive, who shook his head within minutes of arriving in the world and accepted his mother's attention with the cheerful urgency of a creature that has not yet learned anything about difficulty. Opal sat back against the wall of the stall with what appeared to be enormous relief and pressed her forearm across her eyes for a moment. When she lowered it, there was the bright sheen of tears that had not quite fallen, and she looked at Wesley with an expression that was completely unguarded in a way that none of her previous expressions had been. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "He's a good colt," Wesley said. "You should be pleased." "I am pleased. I'm also—" She stopped and looked at the colt, who was already attempting to stand. "My father loved this mare," she said. "He would have been beside himself right now." Wesley sat down on the stall floor because it seemed like the right thing to do rather than looming over her, and they both watched the colt figure out his legs in silence for a while. "What was your father like?" Wesley asked, not because he needed to know, but because she seemed like someone who needed to talk about him to someone who would listen without the complicated weight of prior knowing. She looked at him sideways again, that assessing look that he was beginning to recognize as her default response to anything that required trust. Then she began to talk, and she talked for a long time, about Opal Covington, who had come to the territory from Virginia before the war and built the Double C out of nothing, who had taught her to ride before she could properly walk, who had strong opinions about the correct way to make coffee and the incorrect way to treat livestock, who had died of a fever in January of 1876 and left her a ranch and a small amount of money and a large amount of accumulated knowledge and the particular loneliness of being suddenly the only keeper of your own history. Wesley listened without interrupting because he was, when it mattered, a good listener, and because the story she was telling was one that deserved attention. When she ran out of things to say, she looked slightly embarrassed, the way people do when they have revealed more than they intended. "I don't usually talk about him to people," she said. "Most people in town either knew him and get emotional or didn't know him and don't actually care." "I didn't know him," Wesley said, "but I care." She looked at him for a long, still moment. The colt was standing now on uncertain legs, nursing, and the morning light was coming in through the barn doors in long gold bars, and Opal Covington was looking at Wesley Hawkins with an expression that was not quite anything he could name except that it was the look of someone making a decision. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Someone passing through," she said. "Everyone who comes to Ember Creek from somewhere else is usually passing through." "Maybe I am passing through," Wesley said, though even as he said it, something in him resisted the idea with a stubbornness he hadn't expected. "Maybe," she said, and she looked back at the colt, and she was smiling that full smile again, and Wesley found himself thinking that this was a very complicated place he had arrived at, and he was not at all certain he minded. He did not pass through. He stayed for May, which became June, which became July, and somewhere in that progression the territory went from being the place he had been sent to being the place he lived, which are two very different things. He continued to work at Hector's livery, but he also began spending his days off at the Double C, initially on the reasonable pretense of various repairs. A broken hinge on the barn door, a section of the paddock fence that had the same problem as the south pasture fence, a roof shingle that had come loose and was allowing rain into the corner of the tack room. But as the summer wore on, the pretenses became thinner and eventually unnecessary, and he simply came, and Opal made no pretense of needing him to have a reason. They developed a rhythm, the way people do when they spend enough time in the same space. She made coffee strong and without apology, and he had learned to appreciate it that way. He arrived early enough to help with the morning feeding, and she let him, which was its own kind of trust. They disagreed about cattle management with considerable vigor. She thought the herd should be pushed to the north pasture in midsummer. He thought the south grazing was underutilized, and both of them argued their positions with the comfortable intensity of people who enjoy the argument without needing to win it. He told her, one evening on the porch as the sun went down in sheets of copper and violet, about Corbindels and the unpaid wages and the cattle, and about the judge and the two choices, and about the territory and the loft above the livery horses. He told it plainly, without embellishment or special pleading, because he had come to believe that Opal Covington's opinion of him was something worth having on honest terms. She listened without speaking and without looking at him until he finished, and then she looked at him directly. "You think I should think less of you for telling me that," she said. "It wasn't a question. I think it's information you ought to have," he said. "You didn't steal those cattle to enrich yourself," she said. "That's how I see it. The law saw it differently." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the pasture where the cattle were becoming silhouettes in the fading light. "My father lost a season's worth of cattle once because a land company decided to move their fences 300 yards into our property while we were away. The law looked the other way because the land company had money and we didn't." She paused. "The law doesn't always see clearly." Wesley felt something in his chest go easier, something he hadn't realized had been tight. "No," he said, "it doesn't." She looked at him, and the light was nearly gone now, and there was something in her eyes that was warm and certain, and entirely unlike the careful assessment she had shown him at the beginning. "I'm glad you chose the territory," she said quietly. He looked back at her and said, "I'm beginning to think the territory was the better choice in every possible sense." She held his gaze for a moment that stretched out until it became its own kind of statement, and then she looked back at the darkening pasture, and he could see the corners of her mouth curving up in the dim light, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, and the silence between them was the warmest thing Wesley had felt in years. August in the New Mexico territory was a season of its own relentless heat, broken by afternoon thunderstorms that rolled in fast from the mountains to the north, and cracked the sky open with a violence that made the land smell electric and alive. Wesley had come to love the storms, which surprised him, because he had never particularly cared about weather before. But there was something about standing in the barn door and watching the black clouds build over the mesa while thunder walked across the distance that felt like watching something honest, and honesty was a thing he had come to value. It was during one of these storms that things between him and Opal shifted from the territory of almost into something actual. They had been in the barn waiting out a particularly aggressive storm, sitting on upturned crates near the open door, watching the lightning play over the mesa. Duchess's colt, whom Opal had named, with characteristic lack of sentiment, Gray, was in the far stall making clear his displeasure at the thunder. The rain was coming down in silver walls, and the air was 30 degrees cooler than it had been an hour ago, and it smelled like the beginning of the world. Opal had a piece of tack in her hands that needed stitching, and she was working on it by the diffuse light of the storm, which was bright enough to work by in pulses and dark between lightning strikes. She had been talking about a problem she was having with a neighbor named Pritchard, who owned the land to the north and had recently suggested, with the specific condescension of a man who has never questioned his own authority, that a woman running a ranch alone might want to consider selling while she still had something worth selling. "And what did you tell him?" Wesley asked. "I told him the Double C was not for sale and neither was my patience," Opal said, stabbing her needle through the leather with a little more force than strictly necessary. Wesley smiled. How did he take that? He did not take it particularly well. He has a way of looking at me like, she stopped and seemed to choose her words, like I'm a problem to be solved rather than a person to be spoken to. He's not the first man to make that mistake, Wesley said. She glanced at him. No, but most of them stop making it after a while when it becomes apparent I'm not going anywhere. Pritchard seems to think persistence will change the equation. It won't, Wesley said, with a certainty that was not really about Pritchard. She looked at him fully then, and the lightning outside threw the barn into sudden sharp brightness and then back into shadow, and in that brief illumination her expression was clear and unambiguous. It was the expression of someone who is about to say something true and has decided the cost of not saying it is higher than the cost of saying it. Wesley, she said, I want to say something and I need you to hear it plainly. All right, he said and waited. I have been doing everything I can to talk myself out of caring about you, she said. I've been very thorough about it. I've listed every reason it would be complicated, and every reason you might not stay, and every reason I don't have time or room for this. And, Wesley said, and none of it has worked even slightly, she said, with the exasperated honesty of a woman who has marshaled all her considerable practical intelligence against an outcome, and discovered that intelligence is occasionally helpless. Wesley was quiet for a moment, and the rain came down hard outside and Gray made a disgruntled noise in his stall, and the thunder rolled away to the east. He set down the piece of rope he had been coiling, because it suddenly seemed like something he should not be doing while saying what he was about to say. Opal, he said, and he turned on his crate to face her fully. I came to this territory with nothing and no particular intention of making anything of myself here. I planned to do the time of exile that was required of me and then figure out something else. But I want you to understand that somewhere around the second week of May, when you argued with me about the North Pasture and were completely right and absolutely unwilling to concede that I wasn't, I stopped thinking about anything else entirely. She was looking at him with an expression that was trying to maintain its characteristic composure and not entirely succeeding. That's a specific memory to have, she said. Have many specific memories of you, he said. I've been collecting them rather helplessly. The lightning came again, and this time when the darkness came back she reached out and put her hand over his just simply, without drama or performance, and the warmth of it was staggering in a way that had nothing to do with the late summer heat. I don't need you to be uncomplicated, she said. I've seen your work. I know who you are in the ways that matter. Then you know more about me than most people do, he said. Yes, she said quite simply, I do. He turned his hand under hers and held it, and outside the storm cracked and rolled and burned the sky. And inside the barn the horses breathed their steady horse breath and Gray eventually calmed down in his stall. And Wesley and Opal sat together with the warm connection of their clasped hands and said very little, which was enough. What came after was not the dramatic, torrential falling that Wesley might have expected from a man who had spent 31 years being fairly unsentimental about most things. It was quieter and more thorough than that, more like water finding its way through stone, patient and inevitable, and eventually complete. He began to understand that he loved her sometime in September, when she came down with a fever for 3 days, and refused to allow it to slow her down beyond the absolutely unavoidable. And he spent those 3 days essentially managing the double C himself, while arguing with her about whether she needed to rest. She was a terrible patient, imperious, impatient, and completely unwilling to believe that the ranch would continue to function without her direct supervision for 48 hours. He found this simultaneously maddening and entirely characteristic and deeply endearing, which was, he supposed, the definition of how love differs from mere admiration. He brought her soup that he made himself from a recipe Hector's wife, Delia, supplied him with, and Opal ate it with the expression of someone who considered being taken care of a mild personal affront but was going to endure it because the soup was actually quite good. You made this, she asked. I did. Where did you learn to make soup? Hector's wife, he said. She seems to have decided I need supervision. Opal looked at the soup and then at him. Delia Beaumont has been attempting to match every eligible man in this territory for 20 years, she said. You should know that. I'm aware she has an interest in the situation, Wesley said. I don't find it particularly objectionable. Opal looked at him over the soup bowl with an expression that was fighting a smile. You are insufferably calm about everything, do you know that? I've been told I'm provoking, he offered. That too, she said, but she was smiling now, and he thought that the sight of Opal Covington smiling while running a slight fever and thoroughly annoyed about being sick was one of the better things he had encountered in 31 years. He told her he loved her in October, on a cold, clear evening when they were on the porch, and the stars were doing the particular thing they do in the high desert, not just present but insistent. The sky so thick with light that it felt like a statement about the scale of things. He said it simply, without elaborate architecture, because it seemed like the kind of thing that should be said plainly or not at all. She was quiet for a moment, and he let the quiet be what it was, because he had learned that Opal's silences were not empty. They were the space in which she arrived at things. I love you, she said, and the way she said it, direct and certain and slightly wondering, as though she was still a little surprised by how completely she meant it, was the best thing Wesley Hawkins had ever heard in his life. He reached over and found her hand in the dark, and she turned her fingers through his, and they sat in the enormous quiet of the desert night and were thoroughly, completely happy. November brought a different kind of weather, cold, dry winds, and the particular quality of light that made the mesa look like something carved from pale fire in the mornings and deep rust in the evenings. It also brought Jedediah Pritchard back, and this time he did not come alone. Pritchard arrived at the Double C on a Tuesday morning with two men Wesley did not recognize, and a demeanor that had escalated from condescension to something more calculated. He wanted to discuss, he said, the question of water rights along the creek's eastern tributary, which ran through the corner of the Double C's south pasture before crossing onto his own land. Wesley was at the Double C when Pritchard arrived, and he stood slightly back and to the side, not inserting himself but present, in the way that a person is present when they have decided their presence matters. Opal met Pritchard on the porch with her arms crossed and an expression of polite finality. The water rights on that tributary were established with the original land grant, Mr. Pritchard. I have the documentation. Documentation can be interpreted in different ways, Pritchard said. Not particularly, Opal said. The language is quite clear. Pritchard's eyes moved to Wesley with the specific hostility of a man who resents a variable that has entered his calculation. Who's this? Wesley Hawkins, Wesley said pleasantly. I work here. Pritchard looked between them with an expression that suggested he had revised some of his assumptions and was not pleased about it. I'll be consulting with my own attorney, he said to Opal, as though she had been arguing this point when she had not. You might want to do the same. I have my father's attorney in Santa Fe, Opal said. I'm happy to have them speak. They'll tell you the same thing I have. Pritchard left without having achieved whatever he had intended, and Opal stood on the porch and watched him go with an expression of controlled irritation. He's going to keep coming, she said. Probably, Wesley agreed. He thinks if he applies enough pressure I'll give up. He clearly doesn't know you, Wesley said. She looked at him sideways, and despite the aggravation of the last 20 minutes she almost smiled. You should write to my father's attorney, she said. Tell them what happened here. I'll draft the letter today. I'll come with you to Santa Fe if it comes to that, Wesley said. She turned to face him fully, and something in her expression was earnest in a way that made his chest feel full and slightly complicated. Wesley, she said carefully, I need to be clear about something. I do not need someone to handle this for me. I have handled it and I will continue to handle it. I know that, he said. I'm not offering to handle it. I'm offering to stand next to you while you handle it, which is entirely different. She looked at him for a long moment and then nodded once firmly in the way of a person accepting a term that they find acceptable. All right, she said. That's a distinction I can respect. He wrote to the attorney with her, side by side at the kitchen table, and she argued about 3 of his word choices and was right about 2 of them, and he conceded those 2 with good grace and held his ground on the 3rd, and she let him, and it was, in its way, as intimate as anything. In December, they were invited to a Christmas gathering at the Beaumont house, which turned out to be approximately half the town arranged in Delia Beaumont's warm and generously provisioned front room. Delia was a small woman of approximately the same age as Hector, who moved through social situations with the cheerful authority of a general who happens to be very fond of everyone in the army. She greeted Wesley and Opal at the door together, looked at their clasped hands with an expression of immense personal satisfaction, and said, "Well, it's about time," with such warmth that neither of them could take offense. There was a fiddler, a young man from a ranch to the south, and he played well enough that the carpet got rolled back and people danced, and Wesley discovered that Opal, who was exceptionally competent at most things, was also an excellent dancer, light on her feet, and with an instinctive sense of rhythm that made dancing with her feel easy and natural, which was not, in Wesley's experience, a universal quality. He pulled her in closer during a slower tune, and she came without resistance, her cheek briefly against his shoulder, and he felt her laugh quietly at something the woman dancing next to them said, and it was the kind of evening that a man tucks away carefully, like a letter he intends to keep. On the way home in the cold dark, the stars doing their insistent desert thing again, she was quiet for a while, and then she said, "Are you happy here?" He looked over at her in the dark. "Yes," he said. "I didn't expect to be, but yes. I want you to be," she said. "I want this to be." She stopped and seemed to be choosing her words with more care than usual. "I want this to be a place you stay because you want to, not because of any requirement or obligation." He understood what she was asking and what she was afraid of, and he also understood that she was not a woman who would be satisfied with reassurance that didn't have substance behind it. "The requirement ended in April," he said. "The judge said I had to leave Kansas. He didn't say I had to stay in the territory. I could leave tomorrow, and no one with legal authority would object." She absorbed this. "I'm still here," he said. She looked at him, and he could see her face well enough in the starlight to see something in it relax into certainty. "Yes," she said, "you are." January was cold and stark and beautiful, and the days were short and clear, and the nights were long and full of stars. Wesley had been spending more time at the Double C and less at the livery, a transition that Hector had facilitated with characteristic practicality by suggesting that perhaps what the Double C needed was a full-time hand rather than a borrowed one. "You're already doing the work," Hector said. "Might as well be official about it." The arrangement was made. Wesley moved his few belongings from the livery loft to the small bunkroom off the back of the Double C's barn, which was warmer and more private than the loft had been, and he began the day in earnest alongside Opal, managing the ranch with the particular satisfaction of work that you have chosen rather than fallen into. They fell into the rhythms of shared labor and shared meals and shared evenings on the porch or at the kitchen table, and Wesley found that the territory which had initially seemed like an imposed sentence had become, without him fully noticing, the absolute center of his geography. Not because it had become familiar, though it had, but because Opal was here, and where Opal was had begun to feel like the specific location of whatever home was going to mean for him. The Pritchard matter resolved itself in February, when the attorney from Santa Fe sent a formal letter confirming that the water rights on the eastern tributary belonged entirely to the Double C, and a secondary letter suggesting that any further challenges would be vigorously and expensively contested. Pritchard, who appeared to have done his own cost-benefit calculation, sent a brief and unsatisfying note to Opal acknowledging the matter and withdrew. Opal read both letters at the kitchen table with a coffee mug in her hand and an expression of quiet, firm satisfaction. "Done," she said. "Done," Wesley agreed. She looked at him across the table. "I have been thinking," she said, in the careful tone she used when approaching a subject she had been considering for some time. "That's generally a warning," Wesley said mildly. She smiled briefly and then returned to her considered expression. "I have been thinking about the ranch and about the future of it and about what I want the next 10 years to look like." She paused, "and I find that in all of those thoughts you are there." Wesley was very still. "I'm not asking anything of you," she said quickly, which told him she was in fact asking something and was trying to give him the exit route of not knowing it. "I'm simply telling you that's where my thoughts go." "Opal," he said. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "I want to say something," he said. "I want to say that my thoughts have been identical. And I want to say that I was going to find the right time to have this conversation, and I kept finding reasons to wait, mostly because I know what you are, and I didn't want to rush something that deserves to be done properly." She looked at him steadily with those clear dark eyes that had assessed him completely and apparently found the assessment satisfactory. "I love you," he said. "I want to be here, not as a hand, not as someone who found himself in the right place by accident. I want to build something with you, this ranch and whatever else comes after, if you'll have me." She was quiet for a moment, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee, and the early morning was just beginning to lighten outside the window, and Opal Covington looked at Wesley Hawkins with the full force of everything she was, all the practicality and the stubbornness and the fierce loyalty and the carefully guarded warmth, and she said, "Yes, that is very precisely what I want." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she looked down at their joined hands and looked up at him with an expression that was incandescent with a happiness she did not yet know how to be unsurprised by. "Then we are in agreement," she said, which was so perfectly, characteristically her that he laughed, and she laughed too, and the morning came in through the kitchen window and found them there, still laughing. He proposed properly in March, with a ring he had ordered from a catalog at the general store, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone the color of the territory sky, which seemed right in a way that diamonds would not have. He got down on one knee on the porch of the Double C in the late afternoon, with the light going gold and the cattle visible in the middle pasture and Gray standing near the paddock fence like a gray ghost, and he said the things that needed to be said in the plainest way he knew how. Opal looked at the ring and then at him, and her eyes were bright with tears she was not going to let fall, which was so completely her that his heart felt enormous with it. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He put the ring on her finger and stood, and she put her arms around him with a fierceness that told him everything about how long she had wanted to do exactly this. And he held her in the warm March afternoon, with the world going quietly golden around them, and felt the absolute, particular, irreversible solidity of a thing that is exactly right. They were married in the Ember Creek Church on a Saturday in May, almost exactly 1 year after Wesley had ridden into town on a cantankerous gray horse, with nothing in his pockets and a judge's decree as his only letter of introduction. The church was full because Delia Beaumont had made it her personal project to ensure that no one within 20 miles was unaware of the event, and the fiddler from the Christmas gathering played again, and Hector stood up as a witness, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had seen this coming from the beginning. Opal wore a cream-colored dress she had made herself, because she was practical even in ceremony, and she walked down the narrow aisle of the listing church with the particular combination of composure and radiance that was entirely her own. And when she reached him and looked at him, the expression on her face was the most beautiful thing Wesley had ever seen, not because it was soft or delicate, but because it was absolutely, unflinchingly certain. The vows were spoken in plain language because both of them preferred plain language, and when the Reverend pronounced them married and Wesley kissed her, Delia Beaumont made a sound that could only be described as triumphant, and several people laughed, and Opal was laughing too when he drew back, which was perfect. The celebration went into the evening at the Beaumont house again, the carpet rolled back and the fiddler playing, and Wesley danced with his wife, which was a phrase that did something extraordinary to his internal geography, and Opal danced with him as though she had always known exactly where his hands should go, which he supposed she had. Late in the evening, when the party was winding down and they were preparing to leave, Hector pulled Wesley aside with the gruff warmth of a man who has decided sentiment is worth the awkwardness. "I want you to know," Hector said, "that when you walked into my livery looking like something the territory had chewed up and considered, I thought you'd be gone in a month." "I thought so too," Wesley said. "I'm glad I was wrong," Hector said and shook his hand firmly. "You're a good man, Wesley Hawkins. You were always a good man. Sometimes it just takes a particular place to make that apparent." Wesley thought about the judge and the gavel and the two choices, and about the long road southwest, and about Opal on her buckboard driving with that focused competence, and about the mare and the foal and the coffee and the storm and all the accumulated days of a year that had rearranged the entire meaning of where he was going. "I believe you're right," he said. The first years of the marriage were the years of building, not dramatic building, not the frontier myth version of heroes conquering wilderness, but the quiet, daily, real kind of building that is less spectacular and more durable. They expanded the herd gradually, 20 head one spring and 15 the next, buying carefully and selling at the right times, making decisions together at the kitchen table, with the finances spread out between them and coffee going cold, because they kept forgetting to drink it. They were, as Hector had predicted, the most stubborn combination of people in the territory, which meant that they argued with frequency and vigor about almost every significant decision, and then arrived at solutions that were usually better than either position had been individually, which was, Wesley had come to believe, the ideal working arrangement. They hired a hand, a young man of 20 named Samuel Reyes, whose family had ranched in the territory for 3 generations, whose knowledge of the land was encyclopedic, and whose manner was quiet and capable. He became part of the rhythm of the double C with the ease of a person finding his correct place, and Opal treated him with the same straightforward respect she had always believed labor deserved. In the spring of their second year of marriage, their son was born. He arrived in March, which was apparently the month for important arrivals at the Double C, and he arrived after a long labor that Opal endured with the stubborn composure of a woman who has decided that difficulty is not going to have the satisfaction of undoing her, though Wesley could see in the set of her jaw and the grip of her hand exactly what it was costing her. He sat beside her the entire time, his hand in hers, talking to her in the low, steady voice he had used with Duchess 2 years ago, and she told him, at one point during a particularly long interval, that comparing her to a foaling mare would be the last mistake he ever made, which made him love her so completely that his chest barely had room for it. The baby was healthy and loud and had Opal's dark hair and what appeared to be Wesley's stubbornness, though it was perhaps early to identify this with certainty. They named him Gene for her father, which seemed to Wesley like the right acknowledgement of who had built this place, and whose love was still embedded in every fence post and water right and carefully maintained outbuilding. Opal held the baby in the morning light while Wesley sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and she looked at her son with an expression so intensely private that Wesley felt he was witnessing something that was not quite for public viewing, and he loved her for it. "He looks like you," she said. "He looks like both of us," Wesley said, which was true. "He looks like my father," she said softly, "around the eyes." Wesley looked at his son and thought about the sequence of choices that had produced this particular morning: the stolen cattle, the judge, the 2 options, the long road, the livery stable and the cantankerous gray horse, and a woman on a buckboard with strong hands and a focused expression who had asked him if he knew fence work. He thought about how much of it had felt like imposed circumstance and how completely it had transformed at some point into the thing he would have chosen above all else if choosing had been on offer. "I'm grateful," he said, which was not quite adequate but was true. Opal looked at him over the baby's head, and her expression was the open, certain, radiant one that she kept almost entirely for him. "So am I," she said, "more than I know how to say." The summer that Jean turned 1, a group of men arrived in Ember Creek attempting to establish what they called a land assessment, which was the language being used for a practice that had been taking valuable grazing land from smaller ranchers across the territory. It was the kind of thing that happened in 1880 with increasing frequency, as Eastern investment companies looked at the territory's resources with appetites that had very little to do with the people already living there. Wesley had heard about it in 2 neighboring counties, and he was not surprised when it arrived in their direction. The men came to the Double C on a Tuesday and spoke to Opal with the smooth official manner of people who have been trained to sound reasonable while proposing something that is not. They wanted access to the Southern Creek banks, which they described as underutilized public land, which it was not, as the land grant clearly demonstrated. Opal listened to them with the expression she reserved for people who were wasting her time, which was a particular combination of patience and absolute implacability. "This land is part of the original Covington land grant," she said. "I have the documentation. Whatever assessment you are conducting, this parcel is not part of it." Wesley stood on the porch beside her and said nothing, because Opal did not need him to say anything, and the men were already reading the situation with a clarity that suggested they would prefer to find easier targets. They took the same approach to 3 other ranches in the area, and Wesley spent several evenings riding out to speak with neighboring ranchers about a collective response. Not a violent one, because violence would only provide the land companies with the excuse they needed, but a coordinated legal and community response that made the administrative cost of pursuing the assessments higher than the potential gain. Hector organized a meeting at the saloon, which was attended by everyone with a stake in the outcome, and the result was a letter signed by every landholder in the area and sent to the territorial governor's office in Santa Fe, accompanied by copies of all relevant land grants and deeds, and a politely worded but entirely unmistakable message that the community of Ember Creek had no interest in being absorbed into any company's vision of productive land management. The land assessment men moved on within a month. The community of Ember Creek remained exactly where it had been, which was where it should be. Opal, reviewing this outcome at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee, said, "The collective approach was the right one." "It usually is," Wesley agreed. She looked at him across the table. Jean was asleep in the other room. The evening was settling over the ranch in layers of quiet, and the lamp between them cast a warm circle of light that made the world feel both intimate and sufficient. "You are good at this," she said. "This being here, being part of a community. I wasn't sure in the beginning if someone who had come here the way you did would ever feel genuinely invested." "I wasn't sure either," Wesley said, "for a while. What changed it?" She asked with the directness that was always her way. He considered the question honestly because it deserved honesty. "You did," he said, "not just because I loved you, though that was most of it, but because watching you build and maintain something with such complete commitment made me want to do the same. You made this place worth belonging to." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see that the words had landed in her with the particular weight of things that matter. "That is a very significant thing to say," she said. "It's a very significant thing to mean," he said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the way she had that first time in the barn during the August storm, and the touch was as warm and certain now as it had been then, without any diminishment at all. Gray, the colt who had been born on that difficult spring morning 3 years ago, was now a solid gray horse of considerable personality, and Opal rode him most days with the ease of someone who had been on horseback their whole life. He had her father's mare's stubbornness and his own particular intelligence, and he and Opal had the relationship of 2 beings who had established their mutual respect through considerable negotiation. Wesley had come to find Gray one of the more entertaining personalities on the property, which, given the personalities involved, was saying something. Their daughter was born in the spring of the 3rd year of their marriage, arriving in early April with considerably less drama than Jean had, as though she had observed the approach her brother had taken and decided efficiency was preferable. They named her Frances for Wesley's mother, who had died when he was 9 and who he had been carrying around quietly ever since. Opal had asked about her one evening the previous winter, in that way she had of asking about the things Wesley held privately, and when he told her, she had said, "Then if we have a daughter, she should be Frances," with the simplicity of someone for whom honoring the people you love is not a complicated question. Jean received his sister with the solemn interest of a 2-year-old confronting a concept that has been discussed in the abstract and is now emphatically concrete. He regarded her for a long moment and then looked at Wesley and said, "Loud," which was accurate. The Double C had expanded by this time. 120 head of cattle, 2 additional sections of land purchased from a neighbor who was retiring and moving to Albuquerque to live with his daughter. The barn rebuilt to double its original size with Samuel's help, and the considerable assistance of several men from town who arrived on a Saturday with tools and were fed lunch by Opal, who had spent the previous 2 days cooking and would not hear any argument about it. Wesley had, over the course of these years, become something he would not have predicted: a rancher, a neighbor, a member of a community, a man whose name people in Ember Creek said with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there. He did not think about Kansas often, and when he did it was without particular weight. It felt like a country he had visited once and did not need to return to. The judge, he supposed, had done him a favor of a very specific kind, by closing one door so thoroughly that he had been forced to find another. He did not feel grateful to the judge, exactly, because the circumstances that had led to the judge's intervention had been unjust, and he did not believe in the sentimental revision of injustice into retrospective blessing. But he believed in the truth of where he had ended up, and where he had ended up was so completely right that the road that had brought him here had become, in its own strange way, part of the rightness. Jean started school in the fall of 1883, riding to town on a small brown mare Wesley had selected for him with careful attention, and he went with the particular combination of excitement and studied casualness of a 5-year-old, who has decided that enthusiasm is not sophisticated. He came home that first afternoon full of news about the other children and the school teacher, a young woman named Miss Aldrich who had come from Ohio and who Jean reported, with the authority of someone who had known her for 6 hours, was very smart and also quite strict. "Sounds promising," Opal said. "She made Thomas Beaumont sit in the corner," Jean reported with considerable satisfaction. "What did Thomas Beaumont do?" Wesley asked. "He said girls couldn't do arithmetic," Jean said. Miss Aldrich disagreed. Opal and Wesley exchanged a look over Jean's head that contained several layers of communication, the topmost of which was mutual appreciation for Miss Aldrich. The years built on each other in the way of good years, full of ordinary days that accumulated into an extraordinary life. The cattle operation grew to a size that was substantial without being unwieldy, managed with the combined intelligence of 2 people who argued productively about almost every decision and trusted each other completely. Samuel Ray's remained with them, and they were eventually able to pay him a fair wage that reflected the value of what he contributed, which was considerably more than fence work and feeding. His knowledge of the territory's water patterns saved them from a significant loss one dry summer, when he identified a shift in the creek's flow weeks before it became critical. Frances grew up on horseback and with strong opinions about everything, which Opal looked upon with an expression that was simultaneously amused and recognizing. She had Wesley's light eyes and Opal's determined jaw, and a temperament that was entirely her own, quick and warm and impatient with slowness in all its forms. She and Jean were close in the way of siblings who are different enough to find each other interesting, and their arguments, which were frequent, had the same productive quality as their parents' arguments, which Wesley took as evidence of something going right. In the winter of 1885, Hector Beaumont's health began to fail, the quiet way of a man who has been strong his whole life and doesn't quite believe in the possibility of weakness. He was not dramatic about it. None of the Beaumonts were dramatic people, but the livery required more management than he could provide, and his son Martin, who had been working a silver mine in Colorado, came back to help. Wesley spent several days a week at the livery during those months, keeping things running with the same ease as his old first days in Ember Creek, though everything was different now, and he was different now, and the town was different, larger and more settled, and the loft above the horses where he had once slept with nothing looked like a very small space from the distance of everything that had come after. Hector died in the spring of 1886, peacefully, in the house that Delia had maintained for 30 years with the same fierce energy she brought to everything. Wesley carried the coffin with Hector's son and 2 other men, and at the graveside he felt the weight of the years and what they contained, all the way back to that first afternoon, when a man he had just met had looked at him for 30 seconds and decided he was hireable, which had been, in its way, the beginning of everything. Delia was magnificent in her grief, present and loving and surrounded by people, because Delia Beaumont had spent 30 years building community, and now the community was there. She squeezed Wesley's hand at the reception and said, "He was very fond of you, you know, from the start," and Wesley said, "I know," because he had. The summer of 1887 brought a dry spell that made everyone in the territory anxious, and required careful management of water resources. And Wesley and Opal spent 2 weeks coordinating with neighboring ranchers to ensure the creek's resources were managed fairly and sustainably. It was the kind of problem that required diplomacy more than force, and Wesley had discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that he was better at diplomacy than he would ever have predicted for a man who had once solved a wage dispute by stealing cattle. He mentioned this to Opal one evening, and she looked at him with the expression she sometimes used when she found something genuinely funny. "You have always been capable of diplomacy," she said. "You were diplomatic with me from the beginning." "I was terrified of you from the beginning," he said. She looked delighted. "You were. You are a formidable person, Opal Hawkins. And yet you married me anyway," she said, with a particular smile that he had never in 10 years been able to look at without feeling it in his chest. "Best decision I ever made," he said. "It was your best available option," she said, which was her way of returning the declaration without performing sentiment, and which he understood and loved completely. Jean was 8 years old by this summer, and had developed a passion for horses that exceeded even Opal's, which was saying something. He could ride with a confidence and instinctiveness that made watching him something between pleasure and relief. He had already begun working alongside Samuel in the mornings before school, learning the land with the accumulation of small daily knowledge that is the only real way to know a place. Frances at 6 was already arguing with everyone about everything in a way that suggested she would need a large and patient world to contain her, which was not a concern because she was also entirely kind, and the arguments were invariably about something that mattered. Wesley sat on the porch one evening in August, with the stars doing their insistent thing and the late summer air carrying the smell of the creek and the grass and the particular warm dust smell of a working ranch in summer, and he thought about the specific sequence of things that had brought him to exactly this chair, on exactly this porch, with his wife reading in the lamplight behind him and his children asleep in the house, and the land spread out in the dark in every direction like a promise kept. He thought about the judge and the gavel and the prison and the territory, and about how the territory had seemed like nothing, an open sentence, a long exile, a holding pattern before real life resumed. He had not known, riding in on Coin in April of 1878, that real life was not waiting for him somewhere else. He had not known that it was here, and that it would present itself to him in the form of a woman on a buckboard who asked him if he knew fence work. He had not known that the place you were sent could become the place you loved, or that the reason you stayed could become the best reason you had ever had for anything. Opal appeared in the doorway behind him, her book in one hand, and she leaned against the door frame and looked out at the night with him. "Come in soon," she said. "It's cooling down." "In a minute," he said. She stepped out and stood beside his chair, and she put her hand on his shoulder, and he reached up and covered her hand with his, the way they had been doing for 10 years, and the gesture was so familiar and so full that it contained everything. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The beginning," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and he could feel her thinking about it too. "You rode in on that terrible gray horse," she said, with the warmth of a remembered thing. "He was not terrible, he was stubborn. He was stubborn and he was terrible, and he bit Hector on the second day." There was laughter in her voice, quiet and warm. "That was between Coin and Hector," Wesley said. "I was not involved." She laughed softly and squeezed his shoulder, and then she went back inside, and he could hear the lamp, and the small domestic sounds of the house settling into the night, and he sat for a few more minutes under the insistent stars and felt the full, completed weight of a life that had become, against all expectation and by means of every available grace, exactly what it was supposed to be. He went inside. The kitchen was warm, the lamp lit, his wife at the table with her book, his daughter's small shoe abandoned in the middle of the floor in the way of small shoes everywhere, his son's jacket on the hook by the door. The coffee was cold on the stove, and he left it because it was late and he didn't need it, and he blew out the lamp on the counter, and Opal looked up. "Done thinking about the beginning?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. She closed her book. "Come to bed." He followed her through the house he had come to know the way you know a person, the particular creak of the second floorboard, the way the bedroom window let in the cold from the north if you didn't latch it properly, the smell of her on the pillow. He had come to all of this by the most circuitous possible route, through theft and judgment and exile and the long road southwest. And he had arrived here, to this house and this woman and this life, as if arriving was the word for something that had no real opposite, that was simply what being home felt like when you had finally and completely stopped looking for something else. He lay in the dark and listened to the land outside, the creek moving in the distance, the cattle in the pasture, the wind in the cottonwoods along the creek bed, and Opal's breathing beside him, even and quiet and present. "Opal," he said softly. She said, on the edge of sleep. "I'm glad I chose the territory," he said. A pause, and then her hand found his in the dark, and she held it, and that was all she said, and it was everything. The following spring, which was the spring of 1888, there was a letter from the Kansas Territorial Administration with Wesley's name on it. A formal notice that, upon review of circumstances and the 10 years that had passed without incident, the restriction on his return to Kansas was lifted. He read it at the kitchen table and set it down and looked at it for a moment. Opal was feeding Frances across the table, and she watched him read it and saw his face, and she said nothing, just waited, which was her way. He picked the letter up and folded it and set it to the side of the table. "Well," he said, "that's that. Does it change anything?" She asked, and her voice was carefully neutral in the way of a person who has asked the important question and is fully prepared for any answer. He looked at her, at the ranch they had built, and the children they were raising, and the 10 years of work and love and accumulated mornings that had made this place what it was, and he felt the answer so completely that it required no deliberation at all. "No," he said, "not a single thing." She held his gaze for a moment, and the particular warm certainty in her expression was the one that had been there since the storm in the barn in August of 1878, the one that had said, "I have made a decision, and the decision is you." It was the same now, exactly the same, and a decade of daily life had not diluted it at all. "Good," she said, and turned back to Frances, who was attempting to feed herself with the focused ambition of a child who has decided she does not require assistance. Wesley folded the letter again and put it in the cold stove later that morning, not dramatically, just as a thing that no longer needed keeping, and he went out to help Samuel with the morning work. And the day began in the way of all their days, with the land and the cattle and the horses and the work, and the voice of his wife calling something from the porch, and the sound of his children, and the particular quality of morning light on the mesa that he would never stop finding extraordinary. The territory had been a sentence once, the long consequence of a choice made in anger on behalf of men who had been wronged. And then it had been a question, can a man who was sent somewhere ever truly belong there? And then, slowly and completely and without ceremony, it had become the answer to every question he had ever had about where he was supposed to be. He had been given the choice of prison or the territory, and he had chosen the territory, and the territory had given him back Opal, and Opal had given him everything else. Jean found him near the south fence that afternoon, riding the small brown mare with the easy competence that had become his natural mode, and he pulled up beside his father and looked out over the pasture where the double C's herd grazed in the afternoon light, and he said, "Papa, Samuel says the north pasture is ready to turn the cattle into." "Tell Samuel I'll look at it tomorrow morning," Wesley said. Jean nodded, and then sat for a moment the way he sometimes sat, quiet and observant, taking in the land with the same attentiveness that both his parents had, that accumulation of knowing that comes from paying attention to a place for long enough that it becomes part of how you see. "Do you like it here?" Jean asked. It was a child's question, direct and genuine, without subtext. Wesley looked out at the mesa in the afternoon light, at the creek line marked by the cottonwoods, at the house and the barn and the paddock where Gray was moving with that particular easy grace of a horse that knows his own ground, at the smoke coming from the kitchen chimney that meant Opal was making something for supper, at the whole accumulated ordinary, extraordinary fact of it. "More than I can say," Wesley said. Jean seemed satisfied with this. He turned the mare and trotted back toward the barn, and Wesley stood in the south pasture for a moment longer, with the warm late afternoon on his face and the land in every direction, and felt the full, complete, permanent reality of a man who has come home. He stayed there for a moment, just long enough to know it thoroughly, and then he turned and walked back toward the house, and through the kitchen window he could see the warm light and the shape of his wife moving inside, and the voice of his daughter announcing something to no one in particular, and the whole living warmth of a life that had been built from nothing in particular into something that was, without question, everything. The door opened before he reached the porch because Opal had seen him coming, the way she always saw him coming, and she stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and the evening light behind her and that expression on her face that was fond and exasperated and completely in love, all at once, the way she always was. "Supper in 10 minutes, she said. "I'll wash up," he said. He walked up the porch steps and she stepped aside to let him in, and her hand caught his as he passed, briefly, the way it always did, that small certain touch that said everything it had always said. He was home. He had been home for 10 years, and he would be home for all the years that came after, and the territory that had once been a sentence had long since become the truest word he knew.